At the beginning of the flight, no one wanted to be near him. Some even made jokes. But in the air, everything can change. And what this father did on that plane, no one has ever forgotten. Stay with me until the end. This story says much more about who we are than you can imagine. Now, subscribe to the channel and we'll be in this together. The fluorescent lights of Gate 23 cast harsh shadows across Enrique's weathered face as he adjusted the small backpack on his shoulder and gently guided his 5-year-old daughter Sophia toward the aircraft entrance. His worn jeans and plain grey t-shirt stood in stark contrast to the business suits and designer clothing of the other passengers boarding the commercial flight. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and responsibilities that weighed heavier than most people could imagine. Sophia clutched her stuffed rabbit with one arm while rubbing her tired eyes with the other. The early morning departure had interrupted her usual sleep schedule, and the unfamiliar airport environment had left her feeling anxious and overwhelmed. As they made their way down the narrow aisle, Enrique's military posture was unmistakable. Straight back, measured steps, alert eyes, though most passengers only noticed his casual attire and the increasingly fussy child at his side. "I don't want to sit here, Daddy," Sophia whimpered as they reached row 14, her voice carrying the edge of an impending meltdown. The seats were cramped, the air felt stuffy, and the gentle hum of the aircraft systems was foreign to her young ears. Enrique knelt down to her level, his voice soft but steady. "I know, sweetheart. It's different from our car rides, but we'll be with Grandma soon. Remember how excited she was on the phone." His large hands were gentle as he helped her into the window seat, but Sophia's distress was evident to everyone within a 3-row radius. The woman in the middle seat, a well-dressed professional with perfectly styled hair and an expensive handbag, watched the interaction with barely concealed annoyance. She had been looking forward to a quiet flight to catch up on work emails, and the prospect of sitting next to a crying child for the next 4 hours was clearly not part of her plan. As the aircraft filled with passengers, Sophia's exhaustion reached its breaking point. The strange smells, the pressure in her ears, and the general chaos of boarding became too much for her small frame to handle. Her whimpers escalated into full sobs, despite Enrique's patient attempts to comfort her with quiet words and gentle strokes of her hair. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," muttered the businessman across the aisle to his companion, making no effort to lower his voice. "Some people shouldn't travel with kids if they can't control them." The woman beside them finally stood up, gathering her belongings with obvious frustration. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant passing by. "I'd like to change seats. I simply cannot tolerate a crying child for the entire flight." Her tone was cold and dismissive, as if Enrique and Sophia were merely inconveniences rather than fellow human beings. Other passengers began to take notice, their conversations shifting to the disruption in row 14. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, others whispered among themselves about irresponsible parents who brought crying children on flights. A few took out their phones, clearly preparing for a long flight of complaints to post on social media about their unfortunate seating situation. Enrique felt the weight of every stare, heard every whispered comment, but his focus remained entirely on his daughter. He had weathered far worse storms than the judgment of strangers, and his priority was clear. Pulling Sophia gently onto his lap, he began humming a soft lullaby, the same one he had sung to her every night since her mother had left them 2 years ago. "Shh, little star," he whispered against her hair, his voice carrying the kind of unconditional love that only a devoted parent possesses. "Daddy's here. We're going on an adventure, remember? Just you and me." The warmth of his embrace and the familiar sound of his voice began to work their magic. Sophia's sobs gradually subsided into hiccups, then into the deep, shuddering breaths of exhaustion. The aircraft's engines hummed louder as they prepared for departure, and the gentle vibration seemed to lull her into a more peaceful state. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Sophia's eyelids grew heavy. The stress of the morning, combined with her father's patient comfort, finally overcame her resistance to the unfamiliar environment. She nestled deeper into Enrique's chest, her small fingers clutching his shirt as she drifted toward sleep. The passengers around them finally fell silent, though the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken judgment. Enrique closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar ache of being misunderstood, of being seen as inadequate when he was giving everything he had. But as Sophia's breathing deepened and her little body relaxed completely in his arms, he knew that her peace was worth every disapproving glance and whispered criticism. The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, and Enrique looked out the small window at the world they were leaving behind, wondering what awaited them at their destination, and whether the journey ahead would be any kinder than the one they had just begun. With Sophia finally sleeping peacefully in his arms, Enrique carefully adjusted his position to ensure her comfort during the flight. Her small head rested against his chest, her breathing deep and steady, tiny fingers still clutched around the worn fabric of his shirt. The stuffed rabbit had fallen to the floor, and he retrieved it with his free hand, tucking it beside her without disturbing her rest. For the first time since boarding, his shoulders relaxed slightly, though his protective vigilance never wavered. The cabin had settled into the routine rhythm of a long flight. Passengers were immersed in their books, laptops, and entertainment systems, but the undercurrent of judgment from the boarding process lingered like an uncomfortable presence. Despite Sophia's peaceful slumber, the atmosphere around row 14 remained tense, as if the earlier disruption had marked them as perpetual troublemakers. 2 rows behind them, a pair of businessmen continued their conversation in what they believed were hushed tones, though their words carried clearly through the recycled cabin air. "I don't understand why airlines don't have child-free sections," one remarked, glancing pointedly in Enrique's direction. "Some of us are trying to work, and we shouldn't have to deal with other people's poor parenting decisions." His companion nodded in agreement, adding, "Exactly." That guy looked completely out of his depth. Probably his first time flying with a kid. These single fathers never know what they're doing. Their assumption stung, not because it questioned his abilities as a parent, but because it reduced his entire relationship with Sophia to a stereotype based on his appearance and circumstances. The flight attendant, who had helped the previous passenger change seats, approached Enrique's room with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her demeanor was cordial, but noticeably cooler than her interactions with other passengers. "Sir, I need you to ensure your electronic devices are in airplane mode," she said, despite the fact that Enrique's phone had been properly configured since before boarding. "It already is," he replied quietly, careful not to wake Sophia. He showed her the screen, displaying the airplane mode icon clearly visible at the top. "I still need you to double-check," she insisted, her tone carrying an edge of condescension that suggested she doubted his competence in this simple task. "We had some concerns during boarding about compliance with safety regulations." Enrique looked up at her with steady eyes that had seen far more serious situations than airplane protocols, but he simply nodded and went through the motions of turning airplane mode off and on again, showing her each step. His military training had taught him to pick his battles carefully, and this wasn't worth the disruption it might cause to his sleeping daughter or the other passengers. The flight attendant moved on without acknowledgement, but not before Enrique caught her sharing a meaningful look with her colleague, the kind of glance that communicated volumes about their shared assumptions regarding his reliability and competence. He lowered his head, taking a deep breath to center himself. The familiar weight of being judged before being known settled over him like an old, unwelcome coat. Around him, the subtle theater of air travel continued. Passengers requested drinks, adjusted reading lights, and shifted in their seats, seeking comfort during the long journey. But Enrique remained still, his focus entirely on the precious cargo in his arms. Sophia stirred occasionally, making small sounds of contentment that reminded him why none of the external judgment mattered. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with his mother before this trip. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, mijo," she had said, using the pet name from his childhood. "Just focus on taking care of that little girl. The rest will take care of itself." At the time, her words had seemed like simple maternal advice. Now, suspended thousands of feet above the ground in a cabin full of strangers who had already decided who he was, those words felt like a lifeline. The passenger who had taken the middle seat after the previous woman's departure, a quiet, elderly gentleman, reading a thick biography, occasionally glanced over with what appeared to be curiosity rather than judgment. His eyes held a kindness that stood in stark contrast to the cold assessment Henrique had grown accustomed to receiving. When Sophia shifted and her rabbit fell again, the man retrieved it without being asked, placing it gently within her reach. "Beautiful child," the man whispered so softly that only Henrique could hear. "You're doing fine." Those 4 simple words, "you're doing fine," carried more weight than the old man could possibly know. In a cabin full of people who had decided that Henrique was inadequate, irresponsible, or unprepared, here was one person who saw something different, one person who chose kindness over judgment. Henrique nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The emotional armor he wore to protect himself from the world's assumptions felt heavier some days than others, and today was proving to be one of the more challenging ones. But Sophia's peaceful breathing against his chest reminded him that his mission was simple: protect her, love her, and get her safely to their destination. Outside the small window, clouds drifted past like cotton balls against the brilliant blue sky. The world below seemed impossibly distant, and for a moment, Henrique allowed himself to imagine that this small space, just him and Sophia, was all that mattered. The whispers, the stares, the assumptions would all fade away eventually, but his love for his daughter would remain constant, unshakable, and more powerful than any judgment the world could pass. The first signs of trouble came as whispers from the cockpit, barely audible over the steady drone of the engines. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced smiles, but their eyes carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, measured and professional, but with an underlying current that made experienced travelers sit up straighter in their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties that require us to alter our flight path slightly. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened, and we ask that you return to your seats if you're currently moving about the cabin. We anticipate this will add approximately 30 minutes to our flight time." Henrique's eyes opened instantly at the word technical. His military training had taught him to read between the lines of official communications, and something in the captain's carefully chosen words sent a familiar alertness coursing through his system. He glanced at Sophia, still sleeping peacefully in his arms, her small face serene and trusting. Whatever was happening, she was safe for now, and that was his primary concern. The cabin lights flickered once, then again, causing several passengers to look up from their devices with expressions of mild concern. The aircraft's engines seemed to change their pitch slightly, a subtle alteration that most civilian passengers wouldn't notice, but that triggered every instinct Henrique had developed during his years in the Air Force. He had spent countless hours in military aircraft, had experienced real emergencies, and he recognized the signs of a crew working to solve a problem they hadn't expected. "Did you see that?" whispered the businessman across the aisle, his voice carrying more anxiety than his earlier complaints about crying children. His companion nodded, both men suddenly more interested in their immediate situation than in their corporate presentations. The casual confidence of routine air travel was beginning to crack around the edges. A woman 3 rows ahead stood up abruptly, her face pale with sudden fear. "What's happening?" she called out to a passing flight attendant, her voice carrying the sharp edge of panic. Those lights weren't supposed to do that, were they? The flight attendant approached with professional calm, but Henrique noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gently guided the woman back to her seat. "Everything is fine, ma'am. We're just experiencing some minor electrical fluctuations. The captain and crew have everything under control." Geek. Her reassurance sounded rehearsed, the kind of response trained into airline employees for situations exactly like this one. The aircraft shuddered slightly, not the gentle turbulence of changing weather patterns, but something more mechanical, more concerning. Several passengers gasped, and a child somewhere in the forward section began to cry. The sound seemed to trigger a chain reaction of anxiety throughout the cabin, as if the collective stress of 150 strangers was suddenly focused on their shared vulnerability at 35,000 feet. Sophia stirred in Henrique's arms, her internal alarm system responding to the change in atmosphere even in sleep. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small sound of distress that broke his heart. He adjusted his hold on her, whispering the same gentle reassurances he had used during thunderstorms when she was younger, when the world seemed scary and unpredictable. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured against her hair. "Daddy's got you. We're just flying through some bumpy air." But even as he spoke the comforting words, his experienced eye was cataloguing details. The way the flight attendants exchanged glances, the subtle change in engine harmonics, the barely perceptible shift in the aircraft's attitude that suggested they were indeed changing course more dramatically than a minor technical difficulty would normally require. The captain's voice returned, this time with less polish and more urgency barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. "Folks, we're going to need everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. We're working through a few issues up here, and we want to make sure everyone stays safe and secure. Flight attendants, please take your seats as well." The instruction for crew members to be seated sent a ripple of genuine fear through the cabin. Passengers who had been casually concerned now sat rigid in their seats, hands gripping armrests, eyes darting between windows and the emergency exits they had ignored during the safety demonstration. The woman who had earlier complained about Sophia's crying was now clutching her pearls with white knuckles, her previous irritation replaced by the kind of fear that makes petty annoyances seem insignificant. Henrique felt Sophia wake fully as the aircraft lurched slightly to one side, her eyes opened wide, immediately seeking his face for reassurance in the way that children do when their world suddenly feels uncertain. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and questioning. "I'm right here, little star," he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension around them. "The airplane is just taking a different path to get us where we're going. Like when we drive around construction on the highway, remember?" But even as he spoke the calming words, Henrique's mind was already shifting into a different mode, the analytical, problem-solving mindset that had served him well during his military career. He began to assess their situation with the cold efficiency of someone trained to function under pressure, even while maintaining the gentle facade of a protective father. The next few minutes would test everything he had learned about staying calm in chaos, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and about the difference between panic and purposeful action. Sophia trusted him completely, and soon, he realized, others might need to as well. The situation deteriorated rapidly as the aircraft banked sharply to the left, causing several passengers to cry out in alarm. Coffee cups slid across tray tables, and the overhead bins creaked ominously as their contents shifted. The elderly woman in seat 18A stood up abruptly, her face flushed with terror, pushing against her seatbelt with trembling hands. "I need to get off this plane," she shouted, her voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. "Something's wrong! I can feel it!" Her panic was infectious, spreading through the cabin like wildfire as other passengers began to shift restlessly in their seats, their own fears amplified by her distress. The flight attendant nearest to her, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, approached with visible uncertainty. Her training had prepared her for routine situations, but the combination of technical difficulties and passenger panic was testing the limits of her experience. "Ma'am, please, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Don't tell me what to do," the elderly woman snapped, continuing to struggle against her restraints. "I've been flying for 40 years and I've never felt anything like this. We're going to crash." Her words sent a wave of terror through nearby passengers, and several others began to vocalize their own fears. Enrique watched the scene unfold with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed panic in high-stress situations before. He could see the flight attendant's confidence crumbling, could observe the way fear was spreading from passenger to passenger like a contagion. In his arms, Sophia had awakened fully and was watching the chaos with wide, frightened eyes. "Daddy, why is everyone scared?" she whispered, her small hand gripping his shirt tighter. "Sometimes grown-ups get scared when they don't understand what's happening," he replied quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "But we're going to be okay. I promise." As the elderly woman's panic escalated, she managed to free herself from her seatbelt and began moving toward the aisle, despite the flight attendant's increasingly desperate pleas. Other passengers were now openly expressing their fear. A businessman was frantically trying to call his wife on his phone. A teenager was crying quietly while her mother held her close. And the two men who had earlier criticized Enrique's parenting were now pale-faced and silent. Enrique made a decision that would change everything. Gently placing Sophia in her seat and ensuring her seatbelt was secure, he stood up with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "Stay right here, sweetheart," he told his daughter softly. "Daddy needs to help some people, but I'll be right back." He moved into the aisle with purposeful strides, his bearing immediately different from moments before. The casual, somewhat defeated posture he had maintained throughout the boarding and early flight was replaced by something unmistakably military. Shoulders squared, head high, eyes alert and assessing. He approached the panicking woman with calm authority. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a tone of command that cut through her hysteria, "I need you to look at me." When she turned, her eyes wild with fear, he continued in the same steady voice. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Enrique Santos, United States Air Force. I've been flying in military aircraft for 15 years, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that this crew knows what they're doing." The use of his military rank and the confidence in his voice had an immediate effect. The woman's struggles slowed, and several nearby passengers turned to look at him with new attention. He reached into his wallet and produced his retired military ID, showing it to the flight attendant who had been struggling to control the situation. "I have experience with aircraft emergencies," he said to her quietly. "Would you like me to help calm the passengers while you coordinate with the cockpit?" The young flight attendant's relief was visible as she nodded gratefully. Enrique turned back to the elderly woman, his voice gentle but authoritative. "Ma'am, I need you to take 3 deep breaths with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that?" As he began demonstrating the breathing technique, his calm presence began to have a stabilizing effect throughout the cabin. Other passengers stopped their frantic conversations to listen, drawn by the quiet authority in his voice and the professional manner in which he was handling the crisis. "Everyone," he said, raising his voice slightly to address the entire cabin, "I know this situation feels frightening, but I want you to know that commercial aircraft are built to handle much more severe problems than what we're experiencing. The crew is trained for exactly these kinds of situations, and they have multiple backup systems in place." A businessman called out, "But what about the electrical problems? The lights were flickering." Enrique nodded acknowledgingly. "Electrical redundancy is one of the strongest features of modern aircraft. Even if we lost primary electrical systems, there are secondary and emergency systems that can maintain all critical functions. What you're feeling right now is the crew being cautious and following proper protocols. His explanation, delivered with the confidence of genuine knowledge and experience, began to work its magic throughout the cabin. Panic was slowly being replaced by cautious hope, fear giving way to the kind of trust that comes from recognizing true competence in a crisis situation. Sophia watched from her seat as her father transformed from the judged and dismissed parent into someone that complete strangers were beginning to look to for leadership and reassurance. Her 5-year-old mind didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could see that the scared adults were becoming less scared when her daddy talked to them. 20 minutes into the emergency, just as Henrique's calm presence had begun to stabilize the cabin atmosphere, a new crisis emerged from the middle section of the aircraft. A sharp cry of distress cut through the relative quiet, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone in severe physical distress. "Help! Someone please help!" A woman's voice carried the desperate edge of genuine terror, not the manageable fear of turbulence, but something far more immediate and life-threatening. "My husband can't breathe. Something's wrong with his heart." Henrique immediately moved toward the commotion, his military training automatically prioritizing the most serious threat to life. He found a man in his mid-50s, overweight and sweating profusely, clutched at his chest while his wife held his shoulders in panic. The passenger's face had taken on an alarming greyish pallor, and his breathing was rapid and shallow, classic signs of cardiac distress that Henrique had seen before in high-stress military situations. "Sir, can you hear me?" Henrique asked, kneeling in the cramped aisle space beside the man's seat. When the passenger nodded weakly, Henrique continued, "I need you to try to stay calm. My name is Henrique, and I have medical training. Can you tell me where the pain is?" The man pointed to his chest with a trembling hand, his voice barely a whisper. "Feels like elephant sitting on my chest. Can't breathe right." The flight attendant who had been coordinating with the cockpit appeared beside them, her face tense with concern. "Sir, we have a medical kit on board, but we're still 30 minutes from the nearest airport for emergency landing. Do you think—" "Get me the medical kit," Henrique said without hesitation, "and ask if there are any doctors or nurses on board. Also, I need you to contact the cockpit and tell them we have a potential cardiac event that's going to require immediate medical attention upon landing." As the flight attendant hurried away, Henrique turned his attention back to the patient. His training from military field medicine was limited compared to a doctor's expertise, but he had dealt with cardiac emergencies during deployment and knew the critical steps that could mean the difference between life and death. "What's your name?" he asked the man, while simultaneously checking his pulse at the wrist, rapid and irregular, confirming his suspicions. "Robert," the man gasped. "Robert Henderson." "Okay, Robert, I need you to focus on my voice and try to relax your shoulders. I know it's scary, but panicking will make your heart work harder." Henrique's voice carried the same calm authority he had used to settle the cabin earlier, but now it was focused with laser precision on keeping one man alive. The medical kit arrived, and Henrique quickly inventoried its contents: basic first aid supplies, an automated external defibrillator, aspirin, and oxygen. Not a full cardiac emergency kit, but enough to work with. He looked up at Robert's wife, who was crying quietly. "Mom, what's your name?" "Linda," she replied through her tears. "Linda, I need you to help me help Robert. Has he had heart problems before? Is he on any medications?" "He had a mild heart attack 2 years ago," she said, her voice steadying slightly as she focused on providing information. "He takes blood pressure medication and a baby aspirin every day." Henrique nodded, already formulating his approach. "I'm going to give him aspirin from the medical kit, and we're going to get him on oxygen. The most important thing right now is keeping him calm and making sure his heart doesn't have to work any harder than necessary. He administered the aspirin and helped Robert adjust his position to make breathing easier, while simultaneously coordinating with the flight attendant to ensure the pilots were aware of the medical emergency's severity. The oxygen mask made an immediate difference in Robert's coloring, though he was still clearly in distress. "Robert, I served in the Air Force for 15 years, Henrique said conversationally, his tone deliberately casual to help reduce the man's stress levels. "I've seen guys come back from much worse situations than this. Your heart is strong. It's just having a bad day. We're going to get through this together." Around them, other passengers watched in fascination as the man they had dismissed as an incompetent parent demonstrated professional-level crisis management skills. The businessman who had earlier complained about crying children was now taking notes on his phone, documenting Henrique's actions with obvious respect. Sophia, still secured in her seat as instructed, watched her father with wide eyes. She couldn't fully understand what was happening, but she could see that the scared man was becoming less scared when her daddy helped him, just like she felt less scared when her daddy helped her during thunderstorms. "The nearest airport with full medical facilities is still 25 minutes away," the flight attendant reported quietly to Henrique. "The captain wants to know if you think the patient can wait that long." Henrique assessed Robert's condition, still distressed but stable, breathing more easily with the oxygen and responding appropriately to questions. "Tell the captain that the patient is stable for transport, but will need paramedics standing by immediately upon landing. Also ask if they can contact the nearest hospital and have a cardiac team ready." As he continued monitoring Robert's vital signs and providing reassurance, Henrique was aware that the entire dynamic of the flight had shifted. The passengers who had earlier judged him as inadequate were now watching him save a life with skills they hadn't known he possessed. But his focus remained singular: keep Robert alive until they could get him proper medical care. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man whose competence had been questioned was now the one person everyone on the aircraft was depending on to handle a life-or-death situation. As Henrique continued monitoring Robert's condition, adjusting the oxygen flow and maintaining constant communication with both the patient and the flight crew, a small voice cut through the controlled chaos of the medical emergency. "Daddy?" Sophia had unbuckled herself and was standing in the aisle, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in one arm, watching the scene with the intense focus that only children can bring to moments they don't fully understand but recognize as important. Her presence immediately caught Henrique's attention, even as he kept one hand on Robert's wrist to monitor his pulse. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice automatically softening despite the crisis situation. Sophia approached slowly, her big eyes taking in the scene: the sick man with the oxygen mask, his crying wife, the worried flight attendants, and her father in the middle of it all, calm and in control. She stopped beside Henrique and looked up at him with an expression of pure trust and curiosity. "Is the sad man going to be okay now, Daddy?" she asked, her small voice carrying clearly through the cabin. The simplicity of her question, the genuine concern in her tone, and the complete confidence she displayed in her father's ability to make everything better had an immediate impact on everyone within hearing distance. Robert's eyes, which had been closed in distress, opened to look at the small girl with something approaching a smile beneath his oxygen mask. "Yes, little star," Henrique replied, never taking his attention completely away from his patient, but including his daughter in the circle of care he had created. "The sad man is going to be much better very soon. The doctors at the airport are going to take very good care of him." Sophia nodded solemnly, then looked directly at Robert. "My daddy is really good at taking care of people," she announced with the absolute certainty that only a beloved child can possess. "He takes care of me every day, and he makes the scary things not scary anymore." Linda, Robert's wife, who had been watching the interaction through her tears, reached out and gently touched Sophia's hand. "Your daddy is a hero, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's helping my husband feel better." The word hero seemed to resonate through the cabin. Other passengers who had been watching the medical emergency unfold began to murmur among themselves, but the tone was completely different from the earlier criticism and judgment. Where there had once been dismissive comments about incompetent parenting, there were now expressions of awe and gratitude. One of the flight attendants, the same young woman who had struggled with the earlier panic situation, approached with a blanket for Robert. As she tucked it around him, she looked at Sophia with obvious admiration. "You're very lucky to have such a wonderful daddy," she said softly. Sophia beamed with pride. "I know," she replied matter-of-factly. "He's the best daddy in the whole world. He can fix anything." A businessman across the aisle, the same one who had earlier made disparaging comments about Enrique's parenting, was now recording the scene on his phone. But unlike the typical social media documentation of problems, his recording captured the profound transformation taking place in the cabin. A child's unwavering faith in her father, a medical emergency being handled with professional competence, and a community of strangers learning not to judge by appearances. "This is incredible," he whispered to his companion. "I was completely wrong about this guy. Look at how he's handling this situation. And look at that little girl. She's not scared at all because she trusts her father completely." Robert's condition had stabilized considerably under Enrique's care. His color was better, his breathing more regular, and the crushing chest pain had subsided to manageable levels. But more than the medical intervention, the presence of Sophia and her absolute confidence in her father seemed to have a healing effect on everyone in the vicinity. "You know what, Robert?" Enrique said, adjusting the man's position slightly to improve his comfort. "My daughter is right. I'm pretty good at taking care of people, and I'm going to make sure you're completely fine when we land. You've got my word on that." Sophia moved closer to her father, and he wrapped one arm around her while maintaining his medical monitoring with the other hand. The image was powerful. A competent professional handling a medical emergency while simultaneously being a loving, protective parent. The contradiction between what passengers had initially assumed about him and what they were witnessing created a profound shift in perspective throughout the cabin. "Daddy," Sophia said quietly, "when we get off the airplane, will the sad man remember that you helped him?" "I think he will, sweetheart," Enrique replied. "Good." Sophia nodded with satisfaction. "Because you're really good at helping people, and everyone should know that." Her innocent proclamation carried more weight than any professional credential or formal recognition. In the eyes of a 5-year-old who knew him better than anyone, Enrique was exactly what he appeared to be in this moment: a protector, a healer, and a hero. The passengers who had initially judged him were beginning to see what Sophia had always known: that true worth isn't measured by appearance or first impressions, but by actions when they matter most. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent for emergency landing. Medical personnel will be standing by." The aircraft began its descent with a subtle change in engine tone that signaled the beginning of the end of their unexpected journey. Enrique maintained his position beside Robert, monitoring the man's vital signs while coordinating final preparations with the flight crew. The patient's condition had remained stable throughout the emergency, and what had initially appeared to be a potentially fatal heart attack had been managed successfully with the limited resources available at altitude. "How are you feeling, Robert?" Enrique asked as the aircraft banked gently toward the airport runway. "Much better," Robert replied, his voice stronger now, though still speaking through the oxygen mask. "I can't thank you enough. When that pain hit, I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Linda squeezed her husband's hand and looked up at Enrique with tears in her eyes. "You saved his life," she said simply. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Enrique shook his head dismissively. "You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad I could help." But even as he spoke the humble words, he was acutely aware of the transformation that had occurred around him. The cabin, which had buzzed with judgment and criticism just hours earlier, now held an entirely different energy. Sophia had remained close throughout the descent, sometimes sitting in her seat as instructed, sometimes standing beside her father when the aircraft was stable. Her presence had become a source of comfort, not just for Henrique, but for other passengers who found something profoundly moving about the little girl's unwavering faith in her father's abilities. As the wheels touched down with a gentle thump, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the cabin. But unlike the typical celebration of a successful landing, this applause had a different quality. It was directed specifically toward the man who had transformed a potential tragedy into a managed emergency. The aircraft taxied toward the gate, where emergency vehicles waited with flashing lights. Paramedics would board immediately to take over Robert's care, but the critical period had passed safely. Henrique helped transfer his patient to the medical professionals, providing a clear, concise report of symptoms, treatment administered, and current condition that impressed the EMTs with its thoroughness and accuracy. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally thank everyone for your cooperation during today's emergency situation. I especially want to acknowledge the assistance of a passenger with military medical training who provided critical support during our medical emergency. His professional response undoubtedly contributed to the positive outcome we achieved today." The announcement sent a ripple of understanding through the cabin. Passengers turned to look at Henrique with new comprehension, finally connecting the dots between the dismissed father from boarding and the competent professional who had just saved a life. The contrast was so stark that many seemed to be seeing him clearly for the first time. Henrique didn't stand to acknowledge the recognition. Instead, he simply gathered Sophia's belongings and prepared for disembarkation with the same quiet efficiency he had demonstrated throughout the crisis. His daughter climbed into his arms, tired from the long day, but proud of her father in the way that children express, through their complete trust and contentment. "Are we going to see Grandma now, Daddy?" Sophia asked, resting her head against his shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart. Grandma is waiting for us," he replied, his voice carrying relief that they had made it safely through an experience that could have ended very differently. As passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark, a different kind of silence fell over the cabin. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of judgment that had characterized the early flight, but rather the contemplative quiet of people processing a profound shift in their understanding of the world around them. The businessman who had earlier complained about crying children approached hesitantly, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of travel, his face carrying an expression of genuine remorse. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions earlier that were completely unfair and wrong." Henrique looked at him with the same calm assessment he had used throughout the crisis. "We all make assumptions sometimes," he replied without rancor. "The important thing is that everyone is safe." The flight attendant who had treated him with condescension during the routine phone check stopped beside his row, her professional demeanor now infused with genuine respect and gratitude. "Sir, I want to apologize for my attitude earlier. Your actions today were extraordinary, and I learned something important about not judging passengers by appearances." Other passengers waited in the aisle, many wanting to express their thanks or apologize for their earlier behavior, but Enrique's focus remained entirely on Sophia and getting her safely to their destination. He accepted the gratitude graciously, but briefly, never making anyone feel worse about their initial reactions, while also not seeking extended recognition for his actions. The elderly woman who had panicked during the emergency made her way over, walking steadily now with the help of her cane. "Thank you for helping me when I was scared," she said softly. "And thank you for saving that man's life. You're a good man, and your daughter is lucky to have you." Sophia looked up at the woman and smiled. "My daddy helps everybody," she said matter-of-factly, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Robert was wheeled past on a stretcher, stable and conscious, with Linda walking beside him holding his hand. He raised his hand in a weak wave toward Henrique and Sophia. "Thank you," he mouthed silently, the words carrying all the weight of a life saved and a family kept together. The silence that followed them as they walked down the jet bridge was filled with respect, gratitude, and perhaps most importantly, the recognition that heroism often comes in unexpected packages. The father, who had been judged as inadequate at the beginning of the flight, was revealed to be exactly the kind of person others hoped to have nearby when life became dangerous and uncertain. Sophia chatted quietly about seeing her grandmother, about the airplane ride, about how proud she was that her daddy had helped the sad man feel better. Her innocent commentary provided the perfect soundtrack to their exit, the voice of someone who had never doubted her father's worth and who had been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. The terminal was busy with the usual chaos of air travel, but for Henrique and Sophia, the noise and activity seemed distant and manageable after what they had just experienced together. They had weathered judgment, crisis, and ultimately triumph, emerging stronger in their bond and clearer in their understanding that the opinions of strangers matter far less than the love and respect of those who truly know us. The jet bridge stretched before them like a tunnel between two worlds. Behind them, the aircraft where Henrique had been transformed from dismissed father to respected hero. Ahead, the terminal where life would resume its normal rhythm, but where the passengers who had witnessed his actions would carry forward a fundamentally altered understanding of appearances versus reality. As they walked toward the gate, Henrique became aware of footsteps behind them, growing into a small procession of fellow passengers who seemed reluctant to simply disperse into the anonymous crowds of the terminal. The weight of their attention was different now. Not the heavy, judgmental stares from boarding, but something warmer and more respectful that made him slightly uncomfortable in its intensity. Sophia skipped alongside him, completely oblivious to the drama that had unfolded around her, chattering excitedly about the adventure they had just shared. "Daddy, when we tell Grandma about the airplane, can we tell her how you made the sad man happy again? I think she'll be really proud of you, too." "We can tell her whatever you want to tell her, little star," Henrique replied, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent hours managing not just a medical emergency, but the complex emotions of an entire cabin full of people. Near the gate seating area, the woman who had changed seats to avoid sitting next to a crying child was waiting, apparently having lingered rather than rushing to her connection. When she saw Henrique and Sophia approaching, she stood up, her designer handbag clutched nervously in her hands, her face carrying an expression of profound discomfort. "Excuse me," she said, stepping into their path, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to." She struggled with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry for my behavior earlier. I judged you and your daughter unfairly, and after what I witnessed today—" She trailed off, shaking her head at her own inadequacy. Henrique stopped, Sophia still holding his hand, and looked at the woman with the same patience he had shown throughout the crisis. "It's okay," he said simply. "We all have difficult days." But the woman wasn't finished. Tears were forming in her eyes as she continued. "No, it's not okay. I complained about a tired child. I treated you like you were a problem to be avoided. And then I watched you save someone's life. I watched how your little girl looks at you, how much she trusts you, and I realized—" She paused, gathering courage. "I realized I've become the kind of person I never wanted to be." Sophia tugged on her father's hand and whispered, "Why is the lady crying, Daddy?" "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they learn something important about themselves," Henrique explained gently, then looked back at the woman. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. The businessman who had recorded parts of the emergency approached next, his phone still in his hand, but his demeanor completely transformed from the arrogant complaints of hours earlier. "Sir, I hope you don't mind, but I captured some of what happened on the plane. Not the medical emergency. I would never invade someone's privacy like that. But the way you calmed everyone down, the way your daughter talked about you." He showed Enrique the phone screen displaying a short video clip. The footage showed Sophia announcing with complete confidence that her daddy was really good at taking care of people, followed by Enrique's calm, professional management of the cabin crisis. The video captured not just the actions, but the transformation of fear into trust, panic into calm, judgment into respect. "I'd like to share this if you're comfortable with that," the businessman continued. "I think people need to see this. People need to understand that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to." Enrique considered the request carefully. His instinct was to refuse, to return to the anonymity he preferred. But he thought about other fathers who might be traveling alone with their children, facing the same unfair assumptions he had encountered. "If you think it might help people be kinder to each other, then yes," he agreed. An elderly gentleman, the same man who had retrieved Sophia's stuffed rabbit and offered quiet encouragement during the early flight, approached with a warm smile. "Young man, I've been flying for 60 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a crisis with more grace and competence than you showed today. Your daughter has every right to be proud of you." Sophia beamed and announced, "He's the best daddy ever." The elderly man chuckled and nodded seriously. "I can see that, sweetheart. I can absolutely see that." As more passengers stopped to offer thanks, apologies, or simply acknowledgement, Enrique began to realize the full scope of what had occurred. The flight had become a microcosm of society's tendency to judge by appearances, and the emergency had forced everyone to confront the gap between their assumptions and reality. A young mother with 2 small children stopped by, her face showing recognition and empathy. "I've been that parent," she said quietly, "dealing with crying children and judgmental stares. Thank you for showing everyone what good parenting actually looks like under pressure." The flight attendants appeared, having completed their post-flight duties. The chief purser, a distinguished woman with silver hair, approached with official paperwork. "Sir, the airline would like to formally recognize your assistance today. We're also going to ensure that Mr. Henderson's family has your contact information in case they'd like to thank you properly once he's recovered." Through it all, Sophia remained the constant, her presence a reminder of why none of the external validation mattered as much as the trust and love of the person who knew him best. She held his hand, leaned against his leg when she got tired, and continued to radiate the confidence that had never wavered throughout the entire experience. As they finally began to move toward the baggage claim, Enrique reflected on the strange journey they had just completed. They had boarded as strangers, subjected to harsh judgment, and they were leaving as heroes worthy of respect and gratitude. But the most important thing remained unchanged. Sophia still looked at him with the same complete trust and love she had always shown, and he was still the same father who would do absolutely anything to protect and care for her. The terminal crowds swallowed them as they walked toward their next destination, but the passengers from their flight carried with them a changed understanding of the danger of first impressions and the power of character revealed under pressure. 3 days after their flight, Enrique was sitting in his mother's kitchen, watching Sophia color pictures of airplanes while they waited for lunch to finish cooking. The peaceful domestic scene felt almost surreal after the intensity of their travel experience, and he was grateful for the return to routine and normalcy. His phone buzzed with a notification, then another, then several more in rapid succession. Curious, he opened his social media app and was stunned to see hundreds of notifications flooding his screen. The video the businessman had taken on the plane had been posted with the caption, "This is what a real hero looks like, and why we should never judge a parent by appearances." The video had been shared thousands of times in just 3 days, accumulating views at an exponential rate as people around the world discovered the story of the dismissed father who became an in-flight hero. Comments poured in from parents who had faced similar judgment, from military personnel who recognized the calm competence of their training in action, and from people who were simply moved by Sophia's unwavering faith in her father. "I've been that judged parent," wrote one mother. "This video reminded me that the opinions of strangers don't matter as much as the love of my children. As a veteran, I recognize that bearing and those skills," commented a retired Navy medic. "Thank you for representing us well and showing that military training serves a purpose long after the uniform comes off. That little girl's confidence in her daddy brought me to tears," shared another viewer. "This is what unconditional love looks like." The hashtag Dong the Airplane Hero began trending across multiple platforms, but as Henrique scrolled through the responses, he noticed something remarkable. The conversation had evolved beyond his specific actions to broader discussions about judgment, assumptions, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Parents shared their own stories of being unfairly criticized, and others admitted to times when they had made hasty judgments they later regretted. A major news network had picked up the story, reaching out through the airline to request an interview. Talk show producers were calling. The airline had offered him free flights for life and wanted to feature him in their next advertising campaign celebrating everyday heroes. But the response that touched him most came from an unexpected source. Robert Henderson, the man he had helped during the medical emergency, had found him through the viral video and sent a heartfelt message. "You saved my life, and I wanted you to know that I made a full recovery. The doctors said your quick action and calm management made all the difference. My grandchildren will grow up knowing about the hero who helped their grandpa. Thank you for showing my family what real strength looks like." Sophia looked up from her coloring book, noticing her father's absorbed attention to his phone. "Daddy, are you looking at the video of us on the airplane?" "I am, sweetheart. A lot of people saw it, and they're saying nice things about us." Sophia nodded seriously, as if this was completely expected. "That's good. Now other people know what I already knew, that you're the best daddy and you help people when they're sad or scared." His mother appeared from the kitchen, having overheard the conversation. "Mijo, you've always been a hero to the people who matter most. It's nice that the rest of the world is finally catching up." Over the following weeks, the video continued to spread, eventually reaching millions of viewers worldwide. It sparked conversations about parental judgment, the danger of assumptions, and the quiet heroism of everyday people. Henrique received messages from single fathers thanking him for representation, from former military personnel proud of how he had represented their values, and from countless parents who felt encouraged to persevere through their own challenging moments. But the most meaningful response came from the passengers who had been on that flight. Many reached out to share how the experience had changed their own behavior, how they found themselves being more patient with struggling parents, more willing to offer help instead of judgment, and more conscious of their own assumptions about others. The businessman who had posted the original video wrote a follow-up post that went viral in its own right. "I learned more about character and heroism in 4 hours on an airplane than in years of business school. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we're quickest to dismiss." Despite the attention and offers that continued to pour in, Henrique maintained his quiet life, focused on raising Sophia and living according to the values that had guided him through military. service and into fatherhood. He granted a few interviews, always emphasizing that his actions were simply what any caring person would do in similar circumstances, and redirecting attention to the importance of supporting parents and veterans in their communities. The video's impact extended far beyond social media. Airlines began implementing new training programs for staff about unconscious bias and passenger judgment. Parenting support groups used it as a discussion starter about the challenges of public parenting. Military transition programs incorporated it as an example of how service members' skills translate into civilian heroism. But perhaps the most important legacy was the countless small interactions that changed because someone had seen the video and remembered not to judge too quickly, to offer help instead of criticism, and to recognize that true character reveals itself not in perfect moments, but in how people respond when life becomes difficult. Sophia continued to color her airplane pictures, occasionally looking up to make sure her father was still there, still the same steady presence he had always been in her life. To her, nothing had really changed. He was still the daddy who made her feel safe, who helped people when they were scared, and who loved her more than anything in the world. And perhaps that was the most profound truth revealed by their viral moment of fame. The greatest heroes are often the ones who have always been heroes to the people who matter most, quietly living their values until the moment when the world finally gets to see what those who love them have always known. The airplane video became more than just a story about a medical emergency or a father defending his parenting. It became a reminder that heroism exists all around us, often in the most unexpected packages, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to a world that too often judges by appearances rather than character. As the attention gradually faded and life returned to normal, Enrique and Sophia continued their daily routines, school drop-offs, bedtime stories, weekend adventures, secure in the knowledge that while the world's recognition had been nice, the only approval that truly mattered was the unwavering love and trust they shared with each other. The last message Enrique received about the video came 6 months later, from a single father in another country. "I was having the worst day with my toddler on a train, feeling judged and inadequate. Then I remembered your video and your little girl's faith in you. It gave me the strength to keep going and be the father my child deserves. Thank you for showing us all what real strength looks like." And in that message, Enrique found the true measure of what their brief moment of fame had accomplished. Not personal recognition, but the encouragement of other parents facing their own difficult moments. The reminder that love and competence often wear humble clothes, and the hope that the world might become a little more compassionate toward those who are simply doing their best to care for the people they love most. How often do we judge before understanding? This story shows that sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. They just want to protect the ones they love. If this story touched you, comment below. Would you have the courage to act like him? What country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has reached. And of course, like, share and subscribe. Here, each story says more about us than it seems.